In Cuisine's International Sparkling Wine tasting this year, it was a really big, broad scale that we looked at. We looked at wines from very elaborately made, complex New Zealand wines made with an eye to champagne, but also with an eye to what sort of fruit is produced in New Zealand for these styles, and the quality aspect of it, starting in the vineyard and then moving through the winemaking process. The level of expertise was terribly impressive in those New Zealand wines. But as well as those New Zealand wines, we had wines from everywhere. There was cheap and cheerful Italian Prosecco, which is a very fashionable wine in bars and bistros and cafes and so forth, right through, speaking of Italy, there's also Asti, the sparkling sweet grapey Moscato, and they're all things at all points in between, Australian wines, American wines. So it was quite revealing when we looked at the results at the end of this tasting to find how well the current crop of New Zealand wines went. At the top end, New Zealand has its own sparkling wine industry that really is worth taking note of in a universal sense. Our top 7 wines in the tasting were all from New Zealand, and they were all bottle fermented, and they were all wines that would stand comparison with the best sparkling wines in the world. They were really very good. And the other message that came through the tasting for us was that you don't actually have to spend the earth to get a really good example of New Zealand sparkling wine. One of our top sparkling wines was Tihana Sparkling Rosé, which was a really elegant, fine, pink sparkling wine with plenty of flavour, but also real style and finesse, and that sells for less than $20. So, you know, while you can spend $40, $50 on a bottle of good quality New Zealand sparkling wine, you can also get good things for under 20. And particularly at the bottom end of the tasting, which doesn't necessarily mean the bottom end in terms of quality, but just a bit below the top wines, there were quite a number of wines that were, you know, even down as low as $12 a bottle, that really were world-class sparkling wines. The top one of all in the international sparkling wine tasting was from a New Zealand company with as much experience with sparkling wine as any, and that's the Hunter's concern. Their history with sparkling wine goes back to the 1980s. The top wine was Hunter's Mirror Reserve, which was a really superb example of just what's possible in this country. Interestingly too, when we're looking at sparkling wines, the best of them nearly always are made by the traditional method that they use in champagne: bottle fermentation, aging on lees in the bottle. And this was really apparent in our top wines in this tasting because of I think we went down from 1 down to number 18 before we got a wine that hadn't been bottle fermented by the traditional method, which is known as the method traditionnelle in New Zealand. You're not allowed to call it the champagne method anymore. When you're thinking about these sparkling wines, the obvious use for them is as aperitifs, you know, something bright and fresh and breezy to start a meal or a grand occasion, or as a celebratory wine for a birthday or a wedding or something like that. But they're also very good things to have open on the table when you're having really good food. They lend themselves to a broad range of things. Dishes like pâtés or terrines seem to go really well with sparkling wines, especially those sparkling wines that have got a fair bit of Pinot Noir in their makeup. But they can also go with the most delicate seafoods, they go with oysters, they go with all sorts of things. Sparkling wine of high quality is the sort of thing that you can actually open at the start of a dinner party and still be drinking at the end of the dinner party. It's the great all-rounder, and I think I'd be quite happy to be served something like this one that I've got in my glass right through a grand dinner.